On this episode, Scott and I welcome Ramy Houssaini, Digital Trust Executive at BNP Paribas, to discuss dealing with the digital supply chain. All that and more on this episode of Below the Surface. This is a Security Weekly production for security professionals by security professionals. Please visit securityweekly.com/subscribe to subscribe to all the shows on our network. Welcome to Below the Surface, the firmware and supply chain podcast from Eclipsium. This is episode 12 for May 31st, 2023. I'm Paul Asadorian. I'm joined by Mr. Scott Shefferman. Scott, welcome.
How you doing, Paul? Super fired up for today. These episodes have just been phenomenal. The guests that we've had on board, and today is absolutely no exception. Cannot wait.
Yes, absolutely. With that, I got just a couple of quick announcements. Our research into the gigabyte vulnerability, or I should say access vector, that's been published to our blog. So make sure you head on over to eclipsium.com and check that out. I think that was all I wanted to announce. That's a great read. It's being very well received by our peers in the community. So make sure you go check that one out. Our guest today is Ramy Houssaini, a global cyber resilience executive and group data protection officer at BNP Paribas. He is a member of the firm's risk executive board, an internationally recognized executive with a unique background in cybersecurity, data privacy, operational risk management, and technology. He has extensive global experience in financial services, consumer goods, telecom, and healthcare industries. Ramy, welcome to the show.
Thank you for having me, Paul. Looking forward to the discussion today.
Absolutely. Ramy, it's nice to have you here. I'd like all of our guests on all of our shows to start with just give us a little bit about your background and how you got your start in information security.
Yeah, so 2 decades of cybersecurity experience. So that explains the hairstyle. So I started actually on the product security side with Motorola, working on automated security controls on infrastructure element for high resilience networks. So that was quite interesting because, that was security as a code, but we didn't call it that then. And I had a great mentor that was passionate about cyber, the fact that it would be a big thing and that it would be multidimensional. And he encouraged me to really pursue experience in different functional roles, operational roles in different industries. So 2 decades later, a lot of experience in the trenches, in mostly global organizations, pretty complex regulatory environments, but very deeply grateful to the amazing community that is the cyber community, all the collaboration, all the partnership, and all the great knowledge.
Outstanding. Yeah, Ramy, I'm excited to pick your brain on a few different topics. Well, one that's certainly top of mind, and we keep getting these not so subtle reminders, is the digital supply chain. So I guess from your perspective, describe the landscape and some of the challenges that we have with the digital supply chain.
That's a great question. Let's just say, first of all, that we all realize, I think collectively as individuals, let alone as enterprises, just in the context of the most recent geopolitical tensions with the Ukraine war and other events, during the COVID pandemic, that we live in a very interconnected world, and our supply chains, plural, depend on different parts of this ecosystem being resilient, being there when we need them. So we make a lot of assumptions, and when we look at how complex it is, when you start unpacking the first layer of your supply chain, your direct third parties, and then the fourth parties, the ones that are providing services to them, and so on and so forth, you realize it's a pretty complex issue that you need to ensure that there are no weak links in that entire chain and that you plan for the unexpected. So for organizations that are operating in critical sectors, so for example, financial services, there are some critical execution chains that the world economy depends on, and enterprises of all sorts depends on. It's quite important to govern these supply chains, to understand the risk, to understand who are your suppliers. And there are always surprises because there are always discovery moments where you realize that via fourth-party relationship, you're exposed to a particular geography, and hence there's might be a concentration risk and so on. So the visibility of your supply chain, I think that became like a hot topic. And with the visibility came the understanding of the different aspects of risks that are associated with a complex supply chain.
Yeah, it's interesting to think about the threat modeling that has to take place because even sometimes us as hackers don't go there. I was speaking to my friend earlier today, and like, what if we couldn't go to the store and buy meat? And what's the equivalent of that in your enterprise, right? As you think about your supply chain, that'd be a really bad day if there was an issue with the food supply chain. And we've flirted with that, a little bit, and there's been a little bit of panic, which I think is good to underscore the issue and rise above the surface. But these are things we have to threat model. Is that part of the solution in your opinion?
Yeah, I mean, accounting for all type of hypotheses is quite important, but also understanding the sophistication of who's against you. I mean, the threat actors understand the weaknesses, understand that there might be some suppliers in your supply chain that may not be as resilient because they're not as big, and their growth essentially fueled expansion without necessarily changing their technology stack. So they look for ways, for the easy way to embed themselves and be able to penetrate the defenses of organizations that sometimes accept that there might be some blind spots in their cyber defense and their cyber profile. So for me, understanding indeed the threats, I mean, modeling, but also having the right visibility into who is actually in your supply chain. That's already in itself quite a challenge. So initiatives around the SBOM are welcome. I think we need to figure out a way to make that exercise a digital one, not an analog one, because things change literally by the minute. Being able to really create more confidence, more assurance activities is quite good. But what we can see, I mean, just from some recent incidents, if you think about Western Digital in April, the folks that are exploiting supply chain weaknesses are actually quite strategic about the choice of the actors and how to actually gain a footprint and be able to launch an attack and disrupt large organizations. So this is something that we absolutely need to understand better by having that enhanced transparency, but also by understanding the exposure.
Ramy, do you think that some of the attacker focus on these supply chain weaknesses is driven by some of our defenses getting better in some of the other areas, such as endpoint and authentication? Like, are attackers going there because they're meeting challenges to accomplish their goals in other areas of the enterprise?
I think there's definitely a recalibration, right, of attack vectors and attack paths, based on where we believe there will be like a weakest link, right? And today, I would also say that typically attackers will follow the trust path. So the path that you're trusting the most without asking any questions, that's probably the likely place of focus for them. So supply chain traditionally has been neglected. I mean, even if you are in a regulated environments, there are assurance activities, but there are no dynamic assurance activities, if you will. We need to get to a point where we're evaluating constantly in real time the risk that a particular provider, of a technology stack, of a software, of a service is actually introducing in the environment. And we need to do that in the same way that we monitor our internal footprint in terms of its hygiene, in terms of its cyber posture. So that's the shift that needs to happen, and I think that the attackers understand that has yet to happen, and hence their focus on this particular aspect.
I love that, because I'm thinking about, if you're doing a really great job at vulnerability and patch management, but you have 3CX software, which was a supply chain attack inside of a supply chain attack inside of a supply chain attack. That is an example, a shining example of attackers taking advantage of just the weakness you described, Ramy.
Yeah, no, you're spot on. I mean, you do a good job defending, in a way, the fortress, but then you don't realize that you have basically connectivity to outside, that you have dependencies, you have links, you're using other type of technologies, and the moment of discovering your exposure in the context of an incident is usually a bad time to be making that discovery. So it's quite important, even vulnerability management, to evolve that, to be thinking about the big V. All types of vulnerabilities, including things that you may not be able to control directly, but that you need to stay on top of to understand, your exposure to, and the exposure of your third parties. Because let's remember again that we're talking also about like the deep supply chain, so the fourth parties and so on. So that whole chain is something that we need to be caring about, but caring about in a dynamic way. I don't believe that that this is a problem that we're going to solve by throwing people at it. We need the right tools that can give us the right telemetry so that we can have a view of the posture in near real time.
So, Paul, so one of the concepts that we play with here is this notion of, I mean, back, I've been doing this about 25 years too, right? So back in the 90s and early 2000s, we used to have a more pure concept of what you might call security control. So you might have authority and responsibility, but it didn't necessarily mean that you had the ability as a leader or a team or organization or mission to actually affect the security and control that security. So when you mention like being more dynamic, and you don't have like your normal visibility into the supply chain that you normally do, it means you don't have security control over those vulnerabilities and threats. And that's starting to finally manifest because, like you said, the threat actors are adapting. They're coming from the IT supply chain, meaning like from the device going up to the operating system, but they're also threats are going down to the supply chain. So they land on a box and packed Windows like any other malware, and then they go down to the firmware because of those vulnerabilities, and they gain all those advantages. And yet most organizations are blind to both of those dynamics, both the threats coming from the supply chain and threats to the supply chain. I'm wondering like what your thoughts are in your experience when it comes to like how do organizations best like take back that security control so they can actually do something inside the enterprise to get ahead of a bad day like you just described?
Yeah, I think that's a great observation. I mean, obviously, the absence of security controls, for example, around hardware, I mean, that could explain some of the recent surprises, right? I commend Eclipsium for the great research. I mean, I saw the report today on, the vendor with a backdoor, and that's a great, continuation of stories that really are telling in the sense that this is an area that have yet to really be fully governed, and we need to pay closer attention to. So, but to answer your question, specifically, I mean, I think first you need to take a step back and think about your technology stack architecturally. I mean, who are your suppliers, and and sometimes who are their suppliers, right? To get that sense of understanding of the dependency. There's a particular industry that does this quite well. I mean, from a slightly different angle, which is like the defense industry. They work on these very complex projects, and they understand the dependencies that they have on their suppliers, their prime subcontractors, and also the providers for their contractors. And they really make sure that they manage all their exposure to that complex chain. Well, we need to import some of those best practices, into other verticals, if you will, and apply that same degree of diligence on what's in your basically environment and what do you depend on. What may actually happen as a result of that analysis is that you may come up with some interesting surprises in terms of the dependency that you have on some small actors that are nowhere in terms of your procurement strategy, or even your strategic tier when you think about them. But in reality, because of what they actually touch in terms of processes within your organization, their impact could be quite substantial. So this is like not an easy problem again to solve, but it does require understanding your environment, understanding who you're working with, and from that understanding, deepening the relationship with these suppliers to understand what they do on their end to maintain their hygiene. How can you be notified when they have issues, and how can you make sure that they are transparent about the issues? Because there is also this issue of transparency that we are still collectively, still working on as an industry.
Yeah, Ramy, I love that point, because we've talked on the show in the past about the small hardware provider, if you will. And the previous guest gave an example. The keys are literally stored on one person's laptop in the organization. And what practices do they have to protect those keys may not be at the same level as all of the other providers. And I think that's an example of what you're talking about. How do you effectively evaluate that risk to your organization? It involves compliance and people being fully transparent and third-party risk assessments. But we all know things can slip through the cracks even in those processes.
I agree. And this is like where we have an issue also of concentration risk, which is in a way, relates to our topic. Because as you start concentrating the relationship and depending on a particular provider for a set of services, so whether it's, in the example that you mentioned, I mean, password management, it could be secret management, which is even worse, right? Or a cloud provider, you're making some assumptions that they are resilient, that they're doing the right things. But, we all know that in security, to be quite frankly successful, you have to be paranoid. You have to be thinking about the worst possible scenarios, and you need to have defense in depth. So we need to apply defense in depth and live with that principle. Even when it comes to our most strategic suppliers, we need to be thinking, what if something goes wrong? What if they actually don't maintain their hygiene? What's my exposure to that particular scenario? Am I able to detect that in near real time? And what is my fallback plan? So all of these things, are back to the threat modeling. I mean, important, but you need to have alternatives, and you need to have additional controls in the environment that can block, abnormal behavior in real time. So I don't think it's just about knowing what the problem is, but being able to absorb it and in real time not be impacted by it. So that's really being resilient, regardless of who introduces that risk to your environment.
Paul, so you hit on something really important, which is I think a lot of organizations don't understand how to actually threat model this. So there's a IT supply chain problem, right? They got that. It's the top of the board. But when you actually go to like register that risk as an enterprise and you threat model ahead of that entry, I think organizations don't realize that a lot of the impacts that these threats can manifest into are ones that are what you might quite literally might call catastrophic or high material impact scenarios, where you can bring down entire data centers at the hardware level, right? At the baseboard management level or the UEFI level, or you can bring down a VPN device of a certain model for an organization indefinitely, and that becomes a severe disruption of operations, of mission, or whatever the context is. And people think, okay, we have backup plans, we have DRP, we have BCP, we have all these things that we've done to be resilient in the face of an impact scenario or an incident. But when you apply that same thinking to the IT supply chain, there's examples where you cannot recover from a baseboard management controllers across an entire segment all being shut down at once, or literally being corrupted at the baseboard management level, and you can't even recover from that. Same with the UEFI at the motherboard level. Same with an externally facing firewall. You'd have to actually replace the device, not restore the device, right? So we have to shift our thinking. And then what reason I bring this in is because I'm cueing in from what you're saying. You're talking about, let's get ahead of this threat. Let's anticipate it. Let's start blocking. Let's get visibility of vulnerabilities and fix those before the bad day happens, because there is no recovery in a lot of these impact scenarios.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, it's great that you're making the distinction that this is about potentially, destroying some quite important assets in your technology stack and not being able to just do a quick modification to bring them back online, but actually needing to replace them. So the idea for me is really, first of all, to understand what could drive that catastrophic scenario, that loss scenario that you mentioned, and prioritize your effort accordingly. I mean, you need to understand what is some of your most critical set of business processes, what's behind it from an infrastructure perspective, what's the stack behind it, and what if essentially something goes wrong, and what is your plan in that particular scenario? The challenge that I see is that this analysis will be done internally, but then you need to also extend it to your external suppliers, your partners, your third parties that are providing services on your behalf. So it's going to require coordination. It's not an easy thing to do, but with the right tooling, with the right platforms, and also if we're able to automate as much as we can, this process needs to be dynamic and can be digital and should be applied at scale. I think we will be a step ahead.
I can't help but think about my pool filter pump, which was causing me trouble this week, and it's really funny because it's exactly what we're talking about right now. I got a brand new pool filter pump directly, it plugs in and it goes to a circuit breaker. Every time I plugged it in, it tripped the breaker. The electrician and I worked to try and figure it out, couldn't figure it out. Finally, just before the show, he was at my house working and realized inside the pool filter pump, there was a short. The casing on the wire had somehow melted or come loose, and it was causing a short every single time. And I'm like, wow, that's a supply chain issue. But the resiliency we're talking about is, in all of this troubleshooting, no one died or got injured because we had a circuit breaker, right? And I think that's some of the things that we need in our own, enterprises and organizations is those fail safes to limit the damage. So, Ramy, I guess my question for you is, what are some recommendations you have to mitigate and reduce the damages that could be caused by supply chain attacks?
Yeah, I love the analogy, and I love, the example that you're making. Indeed, the circuit breakers is exactly what we need. You need to be able to detect abnormal behavior, and your fail-safe mechanism should help you deal with that type of scenario. So, so essentially, we talked about discovery, right? Understanding what's in your supply chain. It's quite important to have that view, and that's a dynamic view, because every week that view is likely to change. Your business partners are likely to launch new product, new capabilities. So just spending a lot of time managing that inventory in a dynamic way, I think is definitely a good step. Next is really to understand how do you stay ahead of the threat curve? How do you augment your threat intelligence so that you're covering specifically, all negative news associated with your suppliers, and how are you able to respond to a particular 0-day or an attack on one of your suppliers, and being able to also understand what's critical in your environment, because obviously you're not going to be able to deploy your effort without understanding what's important and what's less important. So there is a risk prioritization that needs to happen as well. So for me, like, these are at least like three phases that are quite important to enhance the overall resilience. But I go back to the point that you have to, it's a discussion point, right? I mean, it's the concentration risk. Do you want to have a very extended supply chain, or do you want to concentrate your relationship? My personal perspective is, given all what we know today and the challenges of overseeing and working closely with partners, I think we're going to start seeing more and more shift towards concentration of the relationship, because there needs to be that tight coupling in terms of security protocols, in terms of work on hygiene, assurance activities. If you can't scale that for the entire population of your current third parties, you're likely to only be able to do that for a certain tier. So we're likely going to see deeper engagement with suppliers, that actually go beyond the business relationship, the procurement relationship, and we're likely to see some automation in terms of what these suppliers are able to provide in terms of real-time telemetry in their environment, so that we can also act on it and detect if there are some issues and figure out how to apply the circuit breakers that we talked about earlier.
I feel like that can be challenging for enterprises, right? Because we on previous episodes talked about Apple's secure boot technology in their M1 platform, and I think it speaks to your point, Ramy. Like, consolidating in one particular vendor like that, as an example, has some luxuries when it comes to security. They've got a much more tightly coupled ecosystem that they can protect much better. So if you go all Apple, you're in much better shape in that perspective. But how do you manage the different use cases that your business presents to you to go, well, developers want to use this technology and IT wants to use this different technology? How do you balance that when you're looking at your suppliers and your business requirements?
So that's indeed the challenge, right? I mean, you have to look into, yes, you want to maintain the conditions for innovation, but at the same time, I think it's going to be quite difficult to have non-managed diversity of your supply chain. I mean, so don't get me wrong. I'm not suggesting that you get only one supplier for everything. It's okay to have one or two, but you can't have 100 for one particular category. I mean, it's quite important from a governance perspective to understand what you can do and to what extent you can scale this. Now, the exception to this statement is that if we get into some sort of automation that gives us like the right telemetry, where indeed this won't be an issue, then you can obviously accept more complexity. But today, I think the current state of play is very challenging. We need to rationalize and right size the supply chain that could help us understand our exposure, but also and understand what we can do to mitigate that. But it's a constant battle, and I think it's about negotiating, understanding, the pros and cons, and making the right decisions. And the example that you gave with Apple is an interesting one, right? Do you want to put all your eggs in one basket? Well, there are sometimes advantages. Again, because you can deepen the relationship operationally that you have with a particular supplier, and you can really ensure that you're building contingency plans based on their practices, based also on their notification protocols and so on. That may not be an integration that you can do operationally with everyone.
Yeah. And it's interesting, though, in that example, if Apple has a bad day, you also have a bad day. The badness of your day, right, is defined by how tightly you've gone into that one vendor, right? I'm just picking on Apple, right? Could be any, could be your network vendor, could be whatever.
Yeah, I mean, let's face it. We have this today. I mean, it's true. I mean, let's think about certain categories of your technology stack. You have, in a way, very few providers. I mean, even if we think about cybersecurity, our ecosystem, from a marketplace perspective, if you think about the endpoint, it's a very interesting category, right? You start with two. You end up with 12, and then you converge towards 2. So there is basically always a shift to more concentration, and this is true of other things, secrets management, privilege access, management, and so on. We have some parts of our stack that are dependent on a select few numbers of vendors. We need to manage that and understand that in a way that creates a weakness, but at the same time, it creates an opportunity for deeper engagement with your supplier to understand what they are actually doing, what practices they are allowing, not allowing, and to help them in a way understand how you could bring some of your best practices to them. But also ensure that you're able to detect when there are anomalies in their environment that could impact you. So I'm a believer in that deeper operational engagement with the suppliers, because this is not going to be an us versus them type of, in a way, dialogue. I mean, it's going to be very much a collaboration because the incentives are aligned. No one wants to be responsible for a bad day, especially for their clients, and no one wants to be a victim. So there's definitely alignment of incentives, and I believe that pooling, if you will, of focus, of resources is the best way forward, because we are able to then capitalize on all this knowledge and all the the whole ecosystem, and have, in a way, an ecosystem response to this challenge.
I wanted to ask about third-party software because it's one of, I think, the more interesting challenges when we think about software that I'm not developing in-house, right? But software I have some more control over than I do operating system components and below. It creates this interesting category. What are your thoughts on protecting the supply chain and your own environment from third-party software? Like we all run a web browser and a Zoom client and software like that.
Yeah, I mean, I think you need to apply, in a way, zero trust. You need to understand essentially that you may have an issue, and how can you limit the trust that you have in these platforms, right? That they're doing the right thing. So monitoring the telemetry in terms of network access or usage of resources. I mean, that's one way to detect anomaly. being able to understand what baseline of controls you have in place. The biggest challenge is also change management, right? You can't just trust that every change being pushed is going to be a good change. So there is some degree of stress testing of the releases that needs to happen. But I think that we have also innovation in the cybersecurity marketplace to help us navigate this challenge. For example, I'm a big supporter of secure browsers. In terms of their capacity to shrink the exposure to a particular third-party software platform, to give you a little bit more control in terms of what capabilities are available and accessible. But that's just one example of a cybersecurity control that you could deploy to deal with this challenge. I still think that the biggest challenge that we have is around release management. When you have significant updates to this third-party software and you don't really have a lot of time to do the stress testing that is required to be confident that this is actually a healthy package and that you're able to use it. Having said that, I think that also the internally developed software, there's no such thing as 100% internally developed. I mean, it's going to be reusing some external building blocks. So having the right discipline from a DevOps perspective to anticipate from an attack path perspective, what are all the different things that could go wrong, and do I have the right control? Back to the point that Scott was mentioning earlier, the security control, is it there, is it not there? So for example, I'm a big supporter of Oscar as a framework for DevOps security, because it's a good way to understand your exposure, through the different phases. So it's a nice complement to all the other frameworks that we use within the environments, but applied to DevOps.
It begs the question, Ramy, whether it's hardware, software, firmware that comes from a supplier, where does the responsibility fall? How much of the responsibility do we put in our suppliers to deliver something that is secure, and then how much responsibility falls on us? Where does that lie, and what initiatives can help in this scenario?
Well, that's I think you really hit the nail on the head. I mean, this is really the issue. Accountability, first of all, organizationally, it's interesting, right? I mean, you have procurement, you have engineering teams, you have operations teams, production teams, and then you have security. So who's responsible for what in this particular example? But also, to what extent, I mean, there should be maybe like an ecosystem response to this, meaning I don't believe that one organization should be investing heavily in validating that Cisco or another vendor is doing the right things in terms of its hardware and in terms of its the firmware and so on its infrastructure components. There should be some sort of certification process where maybe there's a pooling of resources and everyone is contributing to increase the overall assurance in that process. So, and I also believe that there should be some understanding of the telemetry that should be provided by the suppliers so that we can indeed have the proof that what we are introducing in our internal environment is acceptable. So, I think that it's going to be a combination of continuing to collaborate jointly as industries, as cybersecurity professionals, but also understanding that, from an operational perspective, it's not very easy to determine, well, who's going to be responsible for what. What's clear is that it's going to take a village, and understanding that, we may be looking at how that engagement model can scale with automation.
Yeah, and you're so spot on, Ramy, because what we are implementing in our enterprises for software, hardware solutions is far more dynamic than some of the other examples, like electricity that we talked about, or fire prevention and suppression. Right? They're more finite and static than the very dynamic environments that we have to secure. I mean, we take software updates like from across hundreds of applications and hardware and firmware every single day, and it's constantly changing. And so I agree with your point. We have to collaborate to make sure that there's multiple checks and balances on a continuous level, which begs the question of, with all the talk about SBOMs, what's your take on SBOMs and how we should be using them to help secure the supply chain?
Yeah, so I think it's a great, first of all, initiative. I mean, CISA is pushing for it, and other other agencies are doing the same. And overall, I think post SolarWinds and Log4j, I mean, I think there's definitely an increased awareness that that's the direction of travel. SBOM is not a radically new concept. I mean, it really, depending on which industry we're talking about, I mean, there's definitely there's been a focus on that. The issue that I see is it needs to be automatic. It needs to be real time. We cannot be like creating friction around this topic of SBOM. So for me, I'm a little bit perplexed when I see a lot of startups that are approaching this problem almost as a governance issue. Let us give you like the SBOM. Let's manage the SBOM within this particular platform. That's almost like, table stakes, if you will. We need to kind of be able to leverage the information of the SBOM to map it to events, from a threat intelligence perspective, to also make sure that we are focusing on who are the threat actors that are interested in a particular stack, and then have the right focus in terms of calibrating our defenses to account for this. So from a transparency perspective, it's a step in the right direction. Operationally, we need to kind of make sure that we are not introducing friction by having an analog, if you will, SBOM governance process. It needs to be automated, and it needs to be connected to threat intelligence so that we are able to prioritize our actions.
Scott, I think you're on mute, Scott. I knew Scott was going to jump in there with a question. That's how well I know Scott now. I still can't hear you, Scott. No, I can't hear you. Type me your question, and then I'll read it.
How's this?
Oh, there you go. There he is.
I switched mics. So, I mean, a primary use case for the SBOM, like I was just out in Washington, D.C. speaking to some government folks, and they asked me, like, so, okay, let's say we had perfect SBOM. Let's say we built this thing and we knew the SBOM for every single device across all missions. What would we do with it? Then what? Okay, you have all this information, but can you action it? Can you make decisions? Can you better secure yourself because you have an SBOM? And aside on my feet, I had to come up with what I feel like is the most important use case for SBOM. And it's to your point about an incident, being able to react, because we'll learn that there's a certain software library that's been compromised, let's say by North Korea or a nation state adversary, affecting these two vendors. And these two vendors are the talk of the town at the board level. And you ask yourself, okay, am I exposed to this active threat campaign that's coming from the supply chain in my environment? That's what the board's going to ask, let's say, the CISO. And the CISO needs to be able to answer, yes, we have this exposure in these environments, but also what other devices have the same third-party software vulnerability that was poisoned, right? And you can't answer that if you're only relying on your vendor to tell you there's a CVE that we've patched and here's the that process is way too slow to react to an evolving threat campaign. So instead, you have to be able to query all the devices in your environment and say which ones have this software library and what is my percentage of real estate that is exposed to an active campaign right now. The only way you can answer that is with SBOM. Like you literally, there's no other way to do that unless you have a robust SBOM kind of insight and visibility into all the devices on the network.
I couldn't agree more. I mean, you have to be having that, so what, right, with the SBOM. I mean, it's not skepticism. I mean, I think it's making sure that we understand how we operationally leverage the insight that would be generated from the SBOM. So SBOM could have helped in a scenario like a Log4j, where everyone is like, okay, where do we use this Apache thing in our environment? And that was a big challenge in itself, right? To understand the exposure. So, but beyond understanding the exposure, how do we make sure that the SBOM stays dynamic, and how are we able to, in a way, act on the insights? And acting on the insights is also about comparing notes, figuring out if there are some, quite frankly, items or providers that should never be used, like in a critical service or in a critical infrastructure scenario, based on the maturity or lack of their security practices, and also the lack of governance, around their changes and so on. So this is going to be important. I mean, in terms of extending like the knowledge sharing that we have as a community to also the SBOM. So it's going to increase transparency internally, but also externally, so that we understand, well, who's using what, and that dependency chain will get much clearer as we develop that bigger ecosystem view of where a particular provider is being used in the environment. And I'm sure that as we get that visibility, we will be surprised, and surprise is a good thing, as long as it happens before an incident.
Ramy, you mentioned keeping up with threat actors. What are some of your tips for enterprises that are trying to keep up with threat actor behavior and threat intelligence?
That's a great question. So I'm a big believer in understanding essentially who's interested in you. So active footprint management is quite important. So knowing exactly your digital surface, which changes every day, and knowing basically who is touching your digital footprint, and who are the groups that are behind some of the attacks that you see on your environment. So I believe in focusing on those actors, understanding them, and being able to understand also their footprint from an attack perspective, and work with, it's a public-private partnership that needs to happen to ensure that we're able to disable them in the context of what's possible within each jurisdiction. So it's that deeper understanding of who's really interested in you and who's attacking you, while at the same time keeping your eyes open to understand who are the different actors, understanding also your exposure to geopolitical tensions, and to what extent that could also play out, and to what extent state actors could also be part of your list. So it's a complex situation, but it does require strong coordination with public agencies, for sure.
I agree, because I think what we read about in the press, it's already too late, but it's also like what's already transpired, right? And the attacker groups are already like working a few steps ahead. I was consuming some content this week, and I was like, some groups don't go away. Like, it may appear to go away, but like they really haven't, and they're just operating differently. And I think it's those partnerships you spoke about, Ramy, privately, that they can help you track those things and be effective. Scott, this is the world you play in.
Yeah, no, I mean, like, a comment on that is a great example is the TrickBot Conti group that the Microsoft and U.S. government both worked together, along with some other vendors too, to take down. And they actually were able to take down the command and control and all the modules that malware would take. But that's basically the world's largest criminal multinational intelligence organization, if you actually are just speaking brass tacks. And just because you brought down the name Conti, you did not bring down any of the actors associated with Conti. And now they're working for 12 other, quite literally, ransomware groups, still part of the same nexus. And oh, by the way, because we're talking about IT supply chain, they're extremely adept at attacking firmware. We did tremendous research on when the Conti leaks happened, and we got insights into the private chats with their developers. They were looking at Intel ME. They were looking at fuzzing the spy flash to find vulnerabilities there. They're looking at all different vectors. They had the trick boot module, which we discovered in October of 20. That is a purpose-built module just to look at your motherboard and understand if it has a vulnerability that would allow them to implant at the UEFI, the BIOS level. And these are criminal organizations that also have that dotted line, in this case, to the Russian GRU, FSB, as those nation-state actors that have destructive motives, to your point. And you can't really look at the threat landscape as like nation-states and criminals anymore. They share too much tooling, too many tactics, too many personalities. It's really one nexus when it comes to, like, if I'm in a data center or if I'm in the IT supply chain, if I'm a financial institution in the West at all, or NATO, you have to worry about that type of actor capability. And I think this is a new world. I wouldn't have said that 4 or 5 years ago, honestly. I say that now after the last year or two, when you look at the threat landscape. I think things are fundamentally changing in that regard.
Ramy, closing thoughts on supply chain issues and or threat actors.
Well, first, I mean, I think that this is a strong focus, for us as an industry. I'm talking about the cybersecurity industry, and for good reason. I mean, the incidents that we had over the past few years show that we have some blind spots. So first, coming up with that understanding that, okay, we have this problem, let's figure out how we can solve it in a sustainable way. It's going to require us to improve the transparency in our environment, to figure out if we want to maintain a certain degree of diversity of our supply chain, or if we want to, as we discussed earlier, deepen the operational engagement with some strategic partners so that we can, in a way, rationalize our assurance activities. But it's also going to require that focus on automation, on reducing the friction, on ensuring that we are able to be risk-based in our approach and not necessarily create like additional hurdles for innovation or for really doing more with partners and so on. So the blind spot that I see today, what's missing from the discussion is, while we're having this awareness very much at the right level in an enterprise context, we all forget that we are also consumers of technology, that we leverage for our personal use, a technology stack that may be slightly different from our enterprise stack. And back to Scott's point, I mean, security controls are not the same, in your personal environment versus your enterprise environment. So this is an area that I believe needs to be addressed, because at the moment there is an asymmetry of protection, what you have on the enterprise side and what you have on the personal side. And we, on the personal side, we depend on certain vendors, without mentioning names, that are quite present and highly concentrated. So we need to figure out how we can also address supply chain risk in that context as well. When it comes to threat actors, understanding their motivation, but also keeping track, understanding that maybe you're already compromised, that you already have someone in your environment. So improving detection. I'm a big believer that one of the most phenomenal use cases for AI in any environment is really to improve detection, improve monitoring, and provide ways to accelerate, the reaction time when you detect an anomaly. So this is something that we're going to need to continue to work on. It's going to take close partnership. It's going to take really transparency, but it's going to take also agreeing on certain protocols in terms of notifying everyone when there are some issues, and really understanding that this could really happen to everyone.
Ramy, thank you so much for appearing on this edition of Eclypsium's Below the Surface.
Thank you for having me.
It was a wonderful discussion. Thank you, everyone, for listening and watching this episode. We'll see you next time.